Great group to follow, and I think what we really want to talk about today is that those blind spots. That's where we focus right now, and that's where the focus of RPA. There's two parts to this discussion in these 15 minutes that we have. One of them is looking at the business side of the applications and ensuring that you are efficient in the use of your capital, that you're efficient in your back office. We deal at Eisner, we're a full service accounting firm, and so we deal with small to medium to large organizations. And on the smaller side, what we see is the organizations tend to not focus on the back office activities that are required to run and manage your business. So there are a number of areas where even smaller organizations can leverage technology, perhaps not all the way to robotic process automation, but using other applications, perhaps like a BlackLine or matching tools. We want to talk about what technologies and how they transform the business and governance. Excuse me. Governance is often ignored. In the business environment, they tend to look at it last, and often it's when you start to lose money that governance becomes more and more of an important item. We want to talk about identifying opportunities for automation, that these ideas around automation and the opportunities could be something as simple as when you start your bank accounts, requesting that the banks provide you bank statement information in an Excel format or some sort of a text file, right, versus a PDF that you're going to have to pay a clerk or some individual to key in it in the middle of the night, or you yourself is going to have to do it. And then thinking about and looking at how companies can utilize support, right, to basically to grow your company. On the other side, from the entrepreneur perspective, from a technology, I think there's a significant opportunity to leverage your knowledge around technology to provide accounting support tools. I don't think the environment is baked at all. I think there's still a ton of opportunity to provide services into these types of environments. So the current state of the RP environment, it's pretty amazing how quick it's grown. Basically what we're running into is we're definitely seeing a cultural shift. Change management is continuing to be a challenge. I think this panel was great when they were talking about learning and unlearning and doing things differently, and that's what we're seeing too with robotics and technology, is having to approach things differently and not traditionally. As an accountant, as a CPA, that's always one of my challenges with other accountants, because they tend to be very stoic. They tend to not want to change, and they tend to argue that they tend to focus on what got them here and not necessarily look at what needs to get them moving forward. So changing those attitudes is a real challenge. When we look at what's going on in environments, we're seeing that process automation is most certainly on the forefront of executives' minds as far as what they're going to do. When you start to look at your organization and as you start to grow, you are going to have to decide, are you going to leverage additional human resources or perhaps leverage technology? Most of you being technologists, it's a natural fit. I think you're probably more likely to accept technology to solve your problems than others will. Looking at it for uncovering revenue opportunities, reducing waste and costs. That tends to be what I focus on, is reduction of waste and cost, and mitigating business risk. This is another one. As you start to look at newer organizations, they tend to not look at risk. It's often the last on their mind, and in some cases it can be the result of fraud, right? Somebody is spending money they shouldn't, or maybe not necessarily fraud, just pure waste, right? Purchasing equipment that you may not need, or as they described earlier, jumping into something sooner than you should. Improved customer satisfaction, that's also a big deal. When you start to deal with, for instance, as you start to scale up and sell to a customer, we're all customers of one thing or another, but when you receive invoices that are incorrect, or if you've paid an invoice and you receive one, it tends to be frustrating. So simple things like that are also important when it comes to leveraging technology. Employee morale is also one from an accounting and finance perspective that we're seeing affected by process automation. More and more individuals, mostly the newer entrants into our business, they tend to not want to do the mundane work. They tend to want to do the more exciting work. They do not want to just get stuck, ticking and tying. So that's another one that we're seeing. I think there's a huge opportunity for customer satisfaction. So what's happened over the last, I would say, 10, 15 years? For me, what I find fascinating is when we look at this, we've always wanted to go from an inefficient perspective to an efficient perspective. And even with all the technology, right, that's been around the last 20 years, let's start going back to Oracle and HFM, some of the consolidation tools, the more expensive ones, and SAP, we've really not moved the needle very far forward. We still have, I would argue, probably 50 to 60% of your closing tasks, part of your accounting and finance tasks, they still are very manual processes. It's not been until the advent of RPA that or intelligent automation that we're starting to see those move forward, those trends move forward. It's only begun now. And I talk to different engineers, many of you are engineers, and apparently it has to do with the way the coding is designed. We also see right now there's 3 big players in the automation space around business and back office and operations, and that'll be Blue Prism, Automation Anywhere, and UiPath. Those are kind of the mainstays today. But what I find really exciting, and mostly when I was out at the booth, is talking to the individuals that here at this conference who are also developing some of their own technologies. So I think we're going to see some really neat things come out of these types of activities. I also believe that we'll also see these organizations develop more and more efficient technologies that will be applied into the back office. So how and where do we start? One of the main areas that we like to discuss, and that myself and Greg Fritzke, my partner that I work with, is we really focus on looking at a center of excellence. Even if you're a small organization, what we initially saw probably 3 years ago was organizations were bringing in the technology and dropping it in piecemeal, right, into the organization. They were starting to see some successes. And then if the organization was a medium-sized business, their success actually started to weigh down on the organization because other teams started coming through and saying, gosh, we want this technology. Or at some of the mid-sized companies and larger companies, you actually had other teams running out and buying. For instance, maybe you were using UiPath and another team went out and purchased Automation Anywhere or whatever, right? So they start using different vendors. And now you end up with a situation where you have multiple technologies and nobody's really in charge. Then you start to lack governance around it. So governance and controls are huge. That's probably the second question I get about, after where do we start? Finance is a great place to start. It's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. Then controls. How do we apply controls around this? How do we govern this technology? And what do we do in regards to that technology? When we look at the areas that are ripe for automation, really it's all over, but in the finance stacks, financial close, accounts receivable, accounts payable, applied cash, payroll, tax, right? State and local tax, mostly if you're selling products, right, over the internet, you're selling products that are delivered across the country, right? Think about too some of the products and service offerings that we're looking at. They may be virtual, right? If you're storing and hosting a machine, right? How is that taxed, right? Those are all areas that are ripe for automation. Order to cash is another one. Revenue recognition as you start to get a little bit bigger. As your organization gets bigger, revenue recognition is important. Well, why? Well, because you're going to have to pay commission salary, right? So you want to make sure that your commissions and your revenue roll together and your cash. Procure to pay is an excellent area too for automation, in that you wouldn't be able to buy something or generate an invoice for an item without proper approval and review. And that, I've worked with several startups, and that's always a challenge. Individuals run out and purchase things that they probably should wait for. So really look at it as a transformation. It's definitely a transformation journey where we're moving from premise technology or, we're seeing newer organizations that are starting perhaps even in the cloud with like a QuickBooks or something like that. But you're probably not going to go from Excel and QuickBooks at the beginning of your business all the way over to RPA. You're going to have to take a journey. You're going to move along that scale from Excel to an RPA environment. If you don't lay the foundation, I can absolutely guarantee you that you'll end up spending more money. I tend to see organizations, that may have 4 or 5 individuals doing the work and paying the salaries for those 4 or 5 individuals, when if they had just thought about it at the beginning, perhaps leverage technology, we're all technologists, and purchase those technologies and integrate them in the business earlier on rather than waiting till the end. Because as we talked about a little bit, change is hard, and once the organization starts to develop a culture around the way they do their activities, then it becomes incredibly difficult to unseat those individuals. And I think I'm getting close to the end here, and I am. So with that, I had 15 minutes and I covered it. Love to answer any questions about automation and what we're seeing in the environment and what organizations are doing. Yes, question?
Just 2 quick things. How do you see this robotics has been evolving, and where are the areas where it is tough to automate? There's probably an opportunity for the humans to feel good right now that their jobs are intact.
I see robotics evolving very, very quickly and becoming accepted throughout the business. I believe we're going to see more and more people enter into this space. And as a matter of fact, I met 2 different groups while I was here that I would be interested in talking to them about developing software, back office software that like our firm would use, right? So that you could start looking at subscription type activities around robotics, because accounting and finance is very mathematical. It's very binary. So it lends itself very well to these things. Did I answer your question?
I was wondering, and where is it hard to do this automation?
I'm sorry?
What are the areas where it is hard to do automation by robotics?
Well, the areas where automation is difficult and doesn't lend itself well is where humans have to do it. So if somebody's giving you an invoice or bringing you a cash in a bag, right, that is a challenge to automate. But the reality is most of the business, even at small new business, it's still electronic. You're going to get your payments electronically. You're going to issue invoices electronically. So the majority of business is really well suited for automation. What happens is, as we talked about, as a business start their cultural journey, they tend to focus on what they know, which is paper or being very efficient, and ultimately in the end it makes it more of a challenge.
Yeah, you talked about accounting and finance as one area where RP is going to make a huge impact. Can you highlight any other areas? Is marketing automation in the pipeline? Is it supply chain? A few other areas that you think RP can be very effectively applied?
Supply chain is an area that we're running into quite a bit of interest around automation, as far as like reordering supplies. If you're actually purchasing equipment, ordering software. If you're actually on the software side and you're issuing licenses, I worked at Nortel many years ago, and that was a real challenge, keeping track of all of our licensing codes that were active or inactive. Or that had termed out, but yet the client was still able to use it and they weren't paying us our fees. And so those would be areas in supply chain. I think that not only basic RPA will be good, but I think other applications like Watson and some of these will become very efficient at looking at perhaps contracts and changing contracts.
Regarding small and medium businesses, robotic process automation, do they see it as a high cost that they need to bear for having that solution?
The question is around cost and high cost. It depends if you compare the cost of automation to an individual. So if you're going to have to go out and hire an accountant, right? One, it's a challenge to find them, and 2, they're not cheap. So if you end up needing 2 or 3 accountants, the question becomes, can I defer the cost of those office people, or do I use automation? Can I leverage automation? So if you think forward, perhaps maybe using electronic EDI type stuff on your payments, requiring that invoices be processed electronically, all these different things you could use in a small business that would also make it efficient. If you're technically savvy, for instance, Blue Prism is a fairly low cost, let's say $3,000 to $5,000 for the license. So that's an area
annum.
where you could probably, if you were sophisticated enough, you could probably build it yourself and do some basic process automation.
$5,000 one time
One license is between $3,000 and $5,000. It's about
for each worker, for each process.
well for the bot, for the software bot, and it could do, you could program ad nauseum, right? You could program until your heart was content.
Thank you very much, Steve,
Thank you.
for a wonderful presentation. And Steve's available outside for you guys if you want to ask more questions.